Chapter 36. A Grim Retrogression, The Phantom of Chance. The Vances, who had been back in the city ever since Christmas, had not forgotten Carrie. But they, or rather Mrs. Vance, had never called on her, for the very simple reason that Carrie had never sent her address. True to her nature, she corresponded with Mrs. Vance as long as she lived in 78th Street. But when she was compelled to move into 13th, her fear that the latter would take it as an indication of reduced circumstances caused her to study some way of avoiding the necessity of giving her address. Not finding any convenient method, she sorrowfully resigned the privilege of writing to her friend entirely. The latter wondered at this strange silence, thought Carrie must have left the city, and in the end gave her up as lost. So she was thoroughly surprised to encounter her in 14th Street, where she had gone shopping. Carrie was there for the same purpose. "Why, Mrs. Wheeler," said Mrs. Vance, looking Carrie over in a glance, "where have you been? Why haven't you been to see me? I've been wondering all this time what had become of you. Really, I'm so glad to see you," said Carrie, pleased and yet nonplussed. Of all times, this was the worst to encounter Mrs. Vance. "Why, I'm living downtown here. I've been intending to come and see you. Where are you living now?" "In 58th Street," said Mrs. Vance, "just off 7th Avenue, 218. Why don't you come and see me?" "I will," said Carrie. "Really, I've been wanting to come. I know I ought to. It's a shame, but you know—" "What's your number?" said Mrs. Vance. 13th Street, said Carrie reluctantly. 112 West. "Oh," said Mrs. Vance, "that's right near here, isn't it?" "Yes," said Carrie. "You must come down and see me sometime." "Well, you're a fine one," said Mrs. Vance, laughing, the while noting that Carrie's appearance had modified somewhat. "The address, too," she added to herself. "They must be hard up." Still, she liked Carrie well enough to take her in tow. "Come with me in here a minute," she exclaimed, turning into a store. When Carrie returned home, there was Hurstwood reading as usual. He seemed to take his condition with the utmost nonchalance. His beard was at least 4 days old. Oh, thought Carrie, if she were to come here and see him? She shook her head in absolute misery. It looked as if her situation was becoming unbearable. Driven to desperation, she asked at dinner, "Did you ever hear any more from that wholesale house?" "No," he said. "They don't want an inexperienced man." Carrie dropped the subject, feeling unable to say more. "I met Mrs. Vance this afternoon," she said, after a time. "Did, eh?" he answered. "They're back in New York now," Carrie went on. "She did look so nice." "Well, she can afford it as long as he puts up for it," returned Hurstwood. "He's got a soft job." Hurstwood was looking into the paper. He could not see the look of infinite weariness and discontent Carrie gave him. "She said she thought she'd call here some day." "She's been long getting round to it, hasn't she?" said Hurstwood, with a kind of sarcasm. The woman didn't appeal to him from her spending side. "Oh, I don't know," said Carrie, angered by the man's attitude. "Perhaps I didn't want her to come." "She's too gay," said Hurstwood significantly. "No one can keep up with her pace unless they've got a lot of money." "Mr. Vance doesn't seem to find it very hard." "He may not now," answered Hurstwood doggedly, well understanding the inference. "But his life isn't done yet. You can't tell what'll happen. He may get down like anybody else." There was something quite knavish in the man's attitude. His eyes seemed to be cocked with a twinkle upon the fortunate, expecting their defeat. His own state seemed a thing apart, not considered. This thing was the remains of his old-time cocksureness and independence. Sitting in his flat and reading of the doings of other people, sometimes this independent, undefeated mood came upon him. Forgetting the weariness of the streets and the degradation of search, he would sometimes prick up his ears. It was as if he said, I can do something. I'm not down yet. There's a lot of things coming to me if I want to go after them. It was in this mood that he would occasionally dress up, go for a shave, and, putting on his gloves, sally forth quite actively. Not with any definite aim. It was a more barometric condition. He felt just right for being outside and doing something. On such occasions his money went also. He knew of several poker rooms downtown, a few acquaintances he had in downtown resorts and about the city hall. It was a change to see them and exchange a few friendly commonplaces. He had once been accustomed to hold a pretty fair hand at poker. Many a friendly game had netted him $100 or more at the time when that sum was merely a sauce to the dish of the game, not the all in all. Now he thought of playing. I might win a couple of hundred. I'm not out of practice. It is but fair to say that this thought had occurred to him several times before he acted upon it. The poker room which he first invaded was over a saloon in West Street, near one of the ferries. He had been there before. Several games were going. These he watched for a time and noticed that the pots were quite large for the ante involved. "Deal me a hand," he said, at the beginning of a new shuffle. He pulled up a chair and studied his cards. Those playing made that quiet study of him which is so unapparent and yet invariably so searching. Poor fortune was with him at first. He received a mixed collection without progression or pairs. The pot was opened. "I pass," he said. On the strength of this, he was content to lose his ante. The deals did fairly by him in the long run, causing him to come away with a few dollars to the good. The next afternoon he was back again, seeking amusement and profit. This time he followed up three of a kind to his doom. There was a better hand across the table, held by a pugnacious Irish youth, who was a political hanger-on of the Tammany district in which they did. Hurstwood was surprised at the persistence of this individual, whose bets came with a sang-froid, which, if a bluff, was excellent art. Hurstwood began to doubt, but kept, or thought to keep at least, the cool demeanor with which, in olden times, he deceived those psychic students of the gaming table, who seemed to read thoughts and moods rather than exterior evidences, however subtle. He could not down the cowardly thought that this man had something better and would stay to the end, drawing his last dollar into the pot, should he choose to go so far. Still, he hoped to win much. His hand was excellent. Why not raise it 5 more? "I raise you 3, said the youth. "Make it 5, said Hurstwood, pushing out his chips. "Come again," said the youth, pushing out a small pile of reds. "Let me have some more chips," said Hurstwood to the keeper in charge, taking out a bill. A cynical grin lit up the face of his youthful opponent. When the chips were laid out, Hurstwood met the raise. "5 again," said the youth. Hurstwood's brow was wet. He was in deep now. Very deep for him. $60 of his good money was up. He was ordinarily no coward, but the thought of losing so much weakened him. Finally, he gave way. He would not trust to this fine hand any longer. "I call," he said. "Full house," said the youth, spreading out his cards. Hurstwood's hand dropped. "I thought I had you," he said weakly. The youth raked in his chips, and Hurstwood came away, not without first stopping to count his remaining cash on the stair. $340, he said. With this loss and ordinary expenses, so much had already gone. Back in the flat, he decided he would play no more. Remembering Mrs. Vance's promise to call, Carrie made one other mild protest. It was concerning Hurstwood's appearance. This very day, coming home, he changed his clothes to the old togs he sat around in. "What makes you always put on those old clothes?" asked Carrie. "What's the use wearing my good ones around here?" he asked. "Well, I should think you'd feel better." Then she added, "Someone might call." "Who?" he said. "Well, Mrs. Vance," said Carrie. "She needn't see me," he answered sullenly. This lack of pride and interest made Carrie almost hate him. Oh, she thought, there he sits. She needn't see me. I should think he would be ashamed of himself. The real bitterness of this thing was added when Mrs. Vance did call. It was on one of her shopping rounds. Making her way up the commonplace hall, she knocked at Carrie's door. To her subsequent and agonizing distress, Carrie was out. Hurstwood opened the door, half thinking that the knock was Carrie's. For once, he was taken honestly aback. The lost voice of youth and pride spoke in him. "Why," he said, actually stammering, "how do you do?" "How do you do?" said Mrs. Vance, who could scarcely believe her eyes. His great confusion she instantly perceived. He did not know whether to invite her in or not. "Is your wife at home?" she inquired. "No," he said. "Carrie's out, but won't you step in? She'll be back shortly." "No," said Mrs. Vance, realizing the change of it all. "I'm really very much in a hurry. I thought I'd just run up and look in, but I couldn't stay. Just tell your wife she must come and see me." "I will," said Hurstwood, standing back and feeling intense relief at her going. He was so ashamed that he folded his hands weakly as he sat in the chair afterwards and thought. Carrie, coming in from another direction, thought she saw Mrs. Vance going away. She strained her eyes but could not make sure. "Was anybody here just now?" she asked of Hurstwood. "Yes," he said guiltily, "Mrs. Vance." "Did she see you?" she asked, expressing her full despair. This cut Hurstwood like a whip and made him sullen. "If she had eyes, she did. I opened the door." "Oh," said Carrie, closing one hand tightly out of sheer nervousness. "What did she have to say?" "Nothing," he answered. "She couldn't stay." "And you looking like that?" said Carrie, throwing aside a long reserve. "What of it?" he said, angering. "I didn't know she was coming, did I?" "You knew she might," said Carrie. "I told you. She said she was coming. I've asked you a dozen times to wear your other clothes. Oh, I think this is just terrible." "Oh, let up," he answered. "What difference does it make? You couldn't associate with her anyway. They've got too much money." "Who said I wanted to?" said Carrie fiercely. "Will you act like it? Rowing around over my looks? You'd think I'd committed—" Carrie interrupted. "It's true," she said. "I couldn't if I wanted to, but whose fault is it? You're very free to sit and talk about who I could associate with. Why don't you go get out and look for work?" This was a thunderbolt in camp. "What's it to you?" he said, rising almost fiercely. "I pay the rent, don't I? I furnish it." "Yes, you pay the rent," said Carrie. "You talk as if there was nothing else in the world but a flat to sit around in. You haven't done a thing for 3 months except sit around and interfere here. I'd like to know what you married me for." "I didn't marry you," he said in a snarling tone. "I'd like to know what you did then in Montreal," she answered. "Well, I didn't marry you," "You can get that out of your head. You talk as though you didn't know." Carrie looked at him in a moment, her eyes distending. She had believed it was all legal and binding enough. "What did you lie to me for, then?" she asked fiercely. "What did you force me to run away with you for?" Her voice became almost a sob. "Force?" he said with a curled lip. "A lot of forcing I did." "Oh," said Carrie, breaking under the strain and turning. "Oh," and she hurried into the front room. Hurstwood was now hot and waked up. It was a great shaking up for him, both mental and moral. He wiped his brow as he looked around and then went for his clothes and dressed. Not a sound came from Carrie. She ceased sobbing when she heard him dressing. She thought at first, with the faintest alarm, of being left without money, not of losing him, though he might be going away permanently. She heard him open the top of the wardrobe and take out his hat. Then the dining room door closed, and she knew he had gone. After a few moments of silence, she stood up, dry-eyed, and looked out the window. Hurstwood was just strolling up the street from the flat towards 6th Avenue. The latter made progress along 13th and across 14th Street to Union Square. Look for work, he said to himself. Look for work. She tells me to get out and look for work. He tried to shield himself from his own mental accusation, which told him that she was right. What a cursed thing that Mrs. Vance's call was anyhow, he thought. Stood right there and looked me over. I know what she was thinking. He remembered the few times he had seen her in 78th Street. She was always a swell looker, and he had tried to put on the air of being worthy of such as she in front of her. Now, to think she had caught him looking this way. He wrinkled his forehead in his distress. The devil, he said a dozen times in an hour. It was 4:15 when he left the house. Carrie was in tears. There would be no dinner that night. What the deuce, he said, swaggering mentally to hide his own shame from himself. I'm not so bad. I'm not down yet. He looked around the square and, seeing the several large hotels, decided to go to one for dinner. He would get his papers and make himself comfortable there. He ascended into the fine parlor of the Morton House, then one of the best New York hotels, and finding a cushioned seat, read. It did not trouble him much that his decreasing sum of money did not allow of such extravagance. Like the morphine fiend, he was becoming addicted to his ease. Anything to relieve his mental distress, to satisfy his craving for comfort. He must do it. No thoughts for the morrow. He could not stand to think of it any more than he could of any other calamity. Like the certainty of death, he tried to shut out the certainty of soon being without $1 completely out of his mind. And he came very near doing it. Well-dressed guests moving to and fro over the thick carpets carried him back to the old days. A young lady, a guest of the house, playing a piano in an alcove pleased him. He sat there reading. His dinner cost him $1.50. By 8 o'clock he was through, and then, seeing guests leaving and the crowd of pleasure-seekers thickening outside, wondered where he should go. Not home. Carrie would be up. No, he would not go back there this evening. He would stay out and knock around as a man who was independent, not broke, might. He bought a cigar and went outside on the corner where other individuals were lounging. Brokers, racing people, thespians, his own flesh and blood. As he stood there, he thought of the old evenings in Chicago and how he used to dispose of them. Many's the game he had had. This took him to poker. I didn't do that thing right the other day, he thought, referring to his loss of $60. I shouldn't have weakened. I could have bluffed that fellow down. I wasn't in form, that's what ailed me. Then he studied the possibilities of the game as it had been played, and began to figure out how he might have won in several instances by bluffing a little harder. I'm old enough to play poker and do something with it. I'll try my hand tonight. Visions of a big stake floated before him. Supposing he did win a couple hundred. Wouldn't he be in it? Lots of sports he knew made their living at this game, and a good living too. They always had as much as I had, he thought. So off he went to a poker room in the neighborhood, feeling much as he had in the old days. In this period of self-forgetfulness, aroused by the first shock of argument and perfected by a dinner in the hotel with cocktails and cigars, he was as nearly like the old Hurstwood as he would ever be again. It was not the old Hurstwood, only a man arguing with a divided conscience and lured by a phantom. This poker room was much like the other one, only it was a back room in a better drinking resort. Hurstwood watched a while and then, seeing an interesting game, joined in. As before, it went easy for a while, he winning a few times and cheering up losing a few pots, and growing more interested and determined on that account. Last, the fascinating game took a strong hold on him. He enjoyed its risks and ventured on a trifling hand to bluff the company and secure a fair stake. To his self-satisfaction, intense and strong, he did it. In the height of this feeling, he began to think his luck was with him. No one else had done so well. Now came another moderate hand, and again he tried to open the jackpot on it. There were others there who were almost reading his heart, so close was their observation. "I have 3 of a kind," said one of the players to himself. "I'll just stay with the fellow to the finish." The result was that bidding began. "I raise you 10. Good. 10 more. Good. 10 again. Right you are." It got to where Hurstwood had $75 up. The other man really became serious. Perhaps this individual, Hurstwood, really did have a stiff hand. "I call," he said. Hurstwood showed his hand. He was done. The bitter fact that he had lost $75 made him desperate. "Let's have another pot," he said grimly. "All right," said the man. Some of the other players quit, but observant loungers took their places. Time passed, and it came to 12 o'clock. Hurstwood held on, neither winning nor losing much. Then he grew weary, and on a last hand lost 20 more. He was sick at heart. At 1:15 in the morning, he came out of the place. The chill, bare streets seemed a mockery of his state. He walked slowly west, little thinking of his row with Carrie. He ascended the stairs and went into his room as if there had been no trouble. It was his loss that occupied his mind. Sitting down on the bedside, he counted his money. There was now but $190 and some change. He put it up and began to undress. "I wonder what's getting into me anyhow," he said. In the morning, Carrie scarcely spoke, and he felt as if he must go out again. He had treated her badly, but he could not afford to make up. Now desperation seized him, and for a day or two, going out thus, he lived like a gentleman, or what he conceived to be a gentleman, which took money. For his escapades, he was soon poorer in mind and body, to say nothing of his purse, which had lost 30 by the process. Then he came down to cold, bitter sense again. "The rent man comes today," said Carrie, greeting him thus indifferently 3 mornings later. "He does?" "Yes, this is the second," answered Carrie. Hurstwood frowned. Then in despair he got out his purse. "Seems like an awful lot to pay for rent," he said. He was nearing his last $100. Chapter 37. The Spirit Awakens, New Search for the Gate. It would be useless to explain how in due time the last $50 was in sight. The 700 by his process of handling had only carried them into June. Before the final 100 mark was reached, he began to indicate that a calamity was approaching. "I don't know," he said one day, taking a trivial expenditure for meat as a text. "It seems to take an awful lot for us to live." "It doesn't seem to me," said Carrie, "that we spend very much." "My money is nearly gone," he said, "and I hardly know where it's gone to." "All that $700? asked Carrie. "All but 100. He looked so disconsolate that it scared her. She began to see that she herself had been drifting. She had felt it all the time. "Well, George," she exclaimed, "why don't you get out and look for something? You could find something." "I have looked," he said. "You can't make people give you a place." She gazed weakly at him and said, "Well, what do you think you will do? $100 won't last long." "I don't know," he said. "I can't do any more than look." Carrie became frightened over this announcement. She thought desperately upon the subject. Frequently, she had considered the stage as a door through which she might enter that gilded state which she had so much craved. Now, as in Chicago, it came as a last resource in distress. Something must be done if he did not get work soon. Perhaps she would have to go out and battle again alone. She began to wonder how one would go about getting a place. Her experience in Chicago proved that she had not tried the right way. There must be people who would listen to and try you, men who would give you an opportunity. They were talking at the breakfast table a morning or two later when she brought up the dramatic subject by saying that she saw that Sarah Bernhardt was coming to this country. Hurstwood had seen it too. "How do people get on the stage, George?" she finally asked innocently. "I don't know," he said. "That there must be dramatic agents." Carrie was sipping coffee and did not look up. "Regular people who get you a place?" "Yes, I think so," he answered. Suddenly the air with which she asked attracted his attention. "You're not still thinking about being an actress, are you?" he asked. "No," she answered. "I was just wondering." Without being clear, there was something in the thought which he objected to. He did not believe anymore, after 3 years of observation, that Carrie would ever do anything great in that line. She seemed too simple, too yielding. His idea of the art was that it involved something more pompous. If she tried to get on the stage, she would fall into the hands of some cheap manager and become like the rest of them. He had a good idea of what he meant by them. Carrie was pretty. She would get along all right, but where would he be? "I'd get that idea out of my head if I were you. It's a lot more difficult than you think." Carrie felt this to contain, in some way, an aspersion upon her ability. "You said I did really well in Chicago," she rejoined. "You did," he answered, seeing that he was arousing opposition, "but Chicago isn't New York by a big jump." Carrie did not answer this at all. It hurt her. "The stage," he went on, "is all right if you can be one of the big guns, but there's nothing to the rest of it. It takes a long while to get up." "Oh, I don't know," said Carrie, slightly aroused. In a flash, he thought he foresaw the result of this thing. Now, when the worst of his situation was approaching, she would get on the stage in some cheap way and forsake him. Strangely, he had not conceived well of her mental ability. That was because he did not understand the nature of emotional greatness. He had never learned that a person might be emotionally, instead of intellectually, great. Avery Hall was too far away for him to look back and sharply remember. He had lived with this woman too long. "Well, I do," he answered. "If I were you, I wouldn't think of it. It's not much of a profession for a woman." "It's better than going hungry," said Carrie. "If you don't want me to do that, why don't you get work yourself?" There was no answer ready for this. He had got used to the suggestion. "Oh, let up," he answered. The result of this was that she secretly resolved to try. It didn't matter about him. She was not going to be dragged into poverty and something worse to suit him. She could act. She could get something and then work up. What would he say then? She pictured herself already appearing in some fine performance on Broadway, of going every evening to her dressing room and making up. Then she would come out at 11 o'clock and see the carriages ranged about, waiting for the people. It did not matter whether she was the star or not. If she were only once in, getting a decent salary, wearing the kind of clothes she liked, having the money to do with, going here and there as she pleased, how delightful it would all be. Her mind ran over this picture all the day long. Hurstwood's dreary state made its beauty become more and more vivid. Curiously, this idea soon took hold of Hurstwood. His vanishing sum suggested that he would need sustenance. Why could not Carrie assist him a little until he could get something? He came in one day with something of this idea in his mind. "I met John B. Drake today," he said. "He's going to open up a hotel here in the fall. He says that he can make a place for me then." "Who is he?" asked Carrie. "He's the man that runs the Grand Pacific in Chicago." "Oh," said Carrie, "I'd get about $1,400 a year out of that." "That would be good, wouldn't it?" she said sympathetically. "If I can only get over this summer," he added, "I think I'll be all right. I'm hearing from some of my friends again." Carrie swallowed the story in all its pristine beauty. She sincerely wished he could get through the summer. He looked so hopeless. "How much money have you left?" "Only $50. "Oh, mercy," she exclaimed. "What will we do? It's only 20 days until the rent will be due again." Hurstwood rested his head on his hands and looked blankly at the floor. Maybe you could get something in the stage line, he blandly suggested. Maybe I could, said Carrie, glad that someone approved of the idea. I'll lay my hand to whatever I can get, he said. Now that he saw her brighten up, I can get something. She cleaned up the things one morning after he had gone, dressed as neatly as her wardrobe permitted, and set out for Broadway. She did not know that thoroughfare very well. To her it was a wonderful conglomeration of everything great and mighty. The theaters were there. These agencies must be somewhere about. She decided to stop in at the Madison Square Theater and ask how to find the theatrical agents. This seemed the sensible way. Accordingly, when she reached that theater, she applied to the clerk at the box office. Eh? He said, looking out. Dramatic agents? I don't know, you'll find them in the Clipper, though. They all advertise in that. Is that a paper? Said Carrie. Yes, said the clerk, marveling at such ignorance of a common fact. You can get it at the newsstands, he added politely, seeing how pretty the inquirer was. Carrie proceeded to get the Clipper and tried to find the agents by looking over it as she stood beside the stand. This could not be done so easily. 13th Street was a number of blocks off, but she went back, carrying the precious paper and regretting the waste of time. Hurstwood was already there, sitting in his place. Where were you? He asked. I've been trying to find some dramatic agents. He felt a little diffident about asking concerning her success. The paper she began to scan attracted his attention. What have you got there? He asked. The Clipper. The man said I'd find their addresses in here. Have you been all the way over to Broadway to find that out? I could have told you. Why didn't you? She asked without looking up. You never asked me, he returned. She went hunting aimlessly through the crowded columns. Her mind was distracted by this man's indifference. The difficulty of the situation she was facing was only added to by all he did. Self-commiseration brewed in her heart. Tears trembled along her eyelids but did not fall. Hurstwood noticed something. Let me look. To recover herself, she went into the front room while he searched. Presently she returned. He had a pencil and was writing upon an envelope. Here are 3, he said. Carrie took it and found that one was Mrs. Bermudez, another Marcus Jenks, a third Percy Weil. She paused only a moment and then moved toward the door. I might as well go right away, she said, without looking back. Hurstwood saw her depart with some faint stirrings of shame, which were the expression of a manhood rapidly becoming stultified. He sat a while, and then it became too much. He got up and put on his hat. I guess I'll go out, he said to himself, and went, strolling nowhere in particular, but feeling somehow that he must go. Carrie's first call was upon Mrs. Bermudez, whose address was quite the nearest. It was an old-fashioned residence turned into offices. Mrs. Bermudez's offices consisted of what formerly had been a back chamber and a hall bedroom marked private. As Carrie entered, she noticed several persons lounging about, men who said nothing and did nothing. While she was waiting to be noticed, the door of the hall bedroom opened, and from it issued 2 very mannish-looking women, very tightly dressed and wearing white collars and cuffs. After them came a portly lady of about 45, light-haired, sharp-eyed, and evidently good-natured. At least she was smiling. Now don't forget about that, said one of the mannish women. I won't, said the portly woman. Let's see, she added. Where are you the first week in February? Pittsburgh, said the woman. I'll write you there. All right, said the other, and the 2 passed out. Instantly, the portly lady's face became exceedingly sober and shrewd. She turned about and fixed on Carrie a very searching eye. Well, she said, young woman, what can I do for you? Are you Mrs. Bermudez? Yes. Well, said Carrie, hesitating how to begin, do you get places for persons upon the stage? Yes. Could you get me one? Have you ever had any experience? Very little, said Carrie. Whom did you play with? Oh, with no one, said Carrie. It was just a show gotten. Oh, I see, said the woman, interrupting her. No, I don't know of anything now. Carrie's countenance fell. You want to get some New York experience, concluded the affable Mrs. Bermudez. We'll take your name, though. What is your address? Inquired a young lady behind the counter, taking up the curtailed conversation. Mrs. George Wheeler, said Carrie, moving over to where she was writing. The woman wrote her address in full, and that allowed her to depart at her leisure. She encountered a very similar experience in the office of Mr. Jenks, only he varied it by saying at the close, if you could play at some local house or had a program with your name on it, I might do something. In the third place, the individual asked, what sort of work do you want to do? What do you mean? Said Carrie. Well, do you want to get in a comedy or on the vaudeville stage or in the chorus? Oh, I'd like to get a part in a play, said Carrie. Well, said the man, it'll cost you something to do that. How much? Said Carrie, who, ridiculous as it may seem, had not thought of this before. Well, that's for you to say, he answered shrewdly. Carrie looked at him curiously. She hardly knew how to continue the inquiry. Could you get me a part if I paid? If we didn't, you get your money back. Oh, she said. The agent saw he was dealing with an inexperienced soul and continued accordingly. You'd want to deposit $50 anyway. No agent would trouble about you for less than that. Carrie saw a light. Thank you, she said. I'll think about it. She started to go and then bethought herself. How soon would I get a place? She asked. Well, that's hard to say, said the man. You might get one in a week, or it might be a month. You get the first thing that we thought you could do. I see, said Carrie, and then, half smiling to be agreeable, she walked out. The agent studied a moment and then said to himself, it's funny how anxious these women are to get on the stage. Carrie found ample food for a reflection in the $50 proposition. Maybe they'd take my money and not give me anything, she thought. She had some jewelry, a diamond ring and a pin and several other pieces. She could get $50 for those if she went to a pawnbroker. Hurstwood was home before her. He had not thought she would be so long seeking. Well, he said, not venturing to ask what news. I didn't find out anything today, said Carrie, taking off her gloves. They all want money to get you a place. How much? Asked Hurstwood. $50. They don't want anything, do they? Well, they're like everybody else. You can't tell whether they'd ever get you anything after you did pay them. Well, I wouldn't put up 50 on that basis, said Hurstwood, as if he were deciding, money in hand. I don't know, said Carrie. I think I'll try some of the managers. Hurstwood heard this, dead to the horror of it. He rocked a little to and fro and chewed at his finger. It seemed all very natural in such extreme states. He would do better later on. Chapter 38. In Elfland Disporting, the Grim World Without. When Carrie renewed her search, as she did the next day, going to the casino, she found that in the opera chorus, as in other fields, employment is difficult to secure. Girls who can stand in a line and look pretty are as numerous as laborers who can swing a pick. She found there was no discrimination between one and the other of applicants, save as regards a conventional standard of prettiness and form. Their own opinion or knowledge of their ability went for nothing. Where shall I find Mr. Gray? She asked of a sulky doorman at the stage entrance of the casino. You can't see him now. He's busy. Do you know when I can see him? Got an appointment with him? No. Well, you'll have to call at his office. Oh, dear, exclaimed Carrie. Where is his office? He gave her the number. She knew there was no need of calling there now. He would not be in. Nothing remained but to employ the intermediate hours in search. The dismal story of ventures in other places is quickly told. Mr. Daly saw no one save by appointment. Carrie waited an hour in a dingy office, quite in spite of obstacles, to learn this fact of the placid, indifferent Mr. Dorney. You will have to write and ask him to see you. So she went away. At the Empire Theater, she found a hive of peculiarly listless and indifferent individuals. Everything ornately upholstered, everything carefully finished, everything remarkably reserved. At the Lyceum, she entered one of those secluded under-stairway closets, berugged and bepaneled, which causes one to feel the greatness of all positions of authority. Here was reserve itself done into a box office clerk, a doorman, and an assistant, glorying in their fine positions. Ah, be very humble now, very humble indeed. Tell us what it is you require. Tell it quickly, nervously, and without a vestige of self-respect. If no trouble to us in any way, we may see what we can do. This was the atmosphere of the Lyceum, the attitude, for that matter, of every managerial office in the city. These little proprietors of business are lords, indeed, on their own ground. Carrie came away warily, somewhat more abashed for her pains. Hurstwood heard the details of the weary and unavailing search that evening. I didn't get to see anyone, said Carrie. I just walked and waited around. Hurstwood only looked at her. I suppose you have to have some friends before you can get in, she added disconsolately. Hurstwood saw the difficulty of this thing, and yet it did not seem so terrible. Carrie was tired and dispirited, but now she could rest. Viewing the world from his rocking chair, its bitterness did not seem to approach so rapidly. Tomorrow was another day. Tomorrow came, and the next, and the next. Carrie saw the manager at the casino once. Come around, he said. The first of next week. I may make some changes then. He was a large and corpulent individual, surfeited with good clothes and good eating, who judged women as another would horseflesh. Carrie was pretty and graceful. She might be put in even if she did not have any experience. One of the proprietors had suggested that the chorus was a little weak on looks. The first of next week was some days off. The first of the month was drawing near. Carrie began to worry as she had never worried before. Do you really look for anything when you go out? She asked Hurstwood one morning as a climax to some painful thoughts of her own. Of course I do, he said pettishly, troubling only a little over the disgrace of the insinuation. I'd take anything, she said, for the present. It will soon be the first of the month again. She looked the picture of despair. Hurstwood quit reading his paper and changed his clothes. He would look for something, he thought. He would go and see if some brewery couldn't get him in somewhere. Yes, he would take a position as a bartender if he could get it. It was the same sort of pilgrimage he had made before. One or two slight rebuffs, and the bravado disappeared. No use, he thought. I might as well go on back home. Now that his money was so low, he began to observe his clothes and feel that even his best ones were beginning to look commonplace. This was a bitter thought. Carrie came in after he did. I went to see some of the variety managers, she said aimlessly. You have to have an act. They don't want anybody that hasn't. I saw some of the brewery people today, said Hurstwood. One man told me he'd try to make a place for me in 2 or 3 weeks. In the face of distress on Carrie's part, he had to make some showing, and it was thus he did so. It was lassitude's apology to energy. Monday, Carrie went again to the casino. Did I tell you to come around today? Said the manager, looking her over as she stood before him. You said the first of the week, said Carrie, greatly abashed. Ever had any experience? He asked again, almost severely. Carrie owned to ignorance. He looked her over again as he stirred among some papers. He was secretly pleased with this pretty, disturbed-looking young woman. Come around to the theater tomorrow morning. Carrie's heart bounded to her throat. I will, she said with difficulty. She could see he wanted her and turned to go. Would he really put her to work? Oh, blessed fortune, could it be? Already the hard rumble of the city through the open windows became pleasant. A sharp voice answered her mental interrogation, driving away all immediate fears on that score. Be sure you're there promptly, said the manager said roughly. You'll be dropped if you're not. Carrie hastened away. She did not quarrel now with Hurstwood's idleness. She had a place. This sang in her ears. In her delight, she was almost anxious to tell Hurstwood. But as she walked homeward and her survey of the facts of the case became larger, she began to think of the anomaly of her finding work in several weeks and his lounging in idleness for a number of months. Why don't he get something? She openly said to herself. If I can, he surely ought to. It wasn't very hard for me. She forgot her youth and her beauty. The handicap of age she did not, and her enthusiasm perceive. Thus ever the voice of success. Still, she could not keep her secret. She tried to be calm and indifferent, but it was a palpable sham. Well, he said, seeing her relieved face. I have a place. You have, he said, breathing a better breath. Yes. What sort of place is it? He asked, feeling in his veins as if now he might get something good also. In the chorus, she answered. Is it the casino show you told me about? Yes, she answered. I begin rehearsing tomorrow. There was more explanation volunteered by Carrie because she was happy. At last, Hurstwood said, Do you know how much you'll get? No, I didn't want to ask, said Carrie. I guess they'll pay $12 or $14 a week. About that, I guess, said Hurstwood. There was a good dinner in the flat that evening, owing to the mere lifting of the terrible strain. Hurstwood went out for a shave and returned with a fair-sized sirloin steak. Now, tomorrow, he thought, I'll look around myself. And with renewed hope, he lifted his eyes from the ground. On the morrow, Carrie reported promptly and was given a place in the line. She saw a large, empty, shadowy playhouse, still redolent of the perfumes and blazonry of the night, and notable for its rich oriental appearance. The wonder of it awed and delighted her. Blessed be its wondrous reality. How hard she would have to try to be worthy of it. It was above the common mass, above idleness, above want, above insignificance. People came to it in finery and carriages to see. It was ever a center of light and mirth. And here she was of it. Oh, if she could only remain, how happy would be her days. What is your name? Said the manager who was conducting the drill. Medenda, she replied, instantly mindful of the name Drouet had selected in Chicago. Carrie Medenda. Well now, Miss Medenda, he said very affably, as Carrie thought, you go over there. And he called to a young woman who was already of the company. Miss Clark, you pair with Miss Medenda. This young lady stepped forward so that Carrie saw where to go, and the rehearsal began. Carrie soon found that while this drilling had some slight resemblance to the rehearsals as conducted at Avery Hall, the attitude of the manager was much more pronounced. She had marveled at the insistence and superior airs of Mr. Millis, but the individual conducting here had the same insistence, coupled with almost brutal roughness. As the drilling proceeded, he seemed to wax exceedingly wroth over trifles, and to increase his lung power in proportion. It was very evident that he had a great contempt for any assumption of dignity or innocence on the part of these young women. Clark, he would call, meaning, of course, Miss Clark, why don't you keep step right there? Why don't you keep step there? By fours, right? Right, I said, right? For heaven's sake, get on to yourself, right? And in saying this, he would lift the last sounds into a vehement roar. Maitland, he called once. A nervous, comely dressed little girl stepped out. Carrie trembled for her out of the fullness of her own sympathies and fear. Yes, sir, said Miss Maitland. Is there anything the matter with your ears? No, sir. Do you know what column left means? Yes, sir. Well, what are you stumbling around the right for? Want to break up the line? I was just. Never mind what you were just. Keep your ears open. Carrie pitied and trembled for her turn. Yet another suffered the pain of personal rebuke. Hold on a minute, cried the manager, throwing up his hands as if in despair. His demeanor was fierce. Elvers, he shouted, what have you got in your mouth? Nothing, said Mrs. Elvers, while some smiled and stood nervously by. Well, are you talking? No, sir. Well, keep your mouth still then. Now, all together again. At last, Carrie's turn came. It was because of her extreme anxiety to do all that was required that brought on trouble. She heard someone called. Mason, said the voice. Miss Mason. She looked around to see who it could be. A girl behind shoved her a little, but she did not understand. You, said the manager. Can't you hear? Oh, said Carrie, collapsing and blushing fiercely. Isn't your name Mason? Said the manager. No, sir, said Carrie. It's Medenda. Well, what's the matter with your feet? Can't you dance? Yes, sir, said Carrie, who had long since learned this art. Why don't you do it then? Don't go shuffling along as if you were dead. I've got to have people with life in them. Carrie's cheek burned with a crimson heat. Her lips trembled a little. Yes, sir, she said. It was this constant urging coupled with irascibility and energy for 3 long hours. Carrie came away worn enough in body, but too excited in mind to notice it. She meant to go home and practice her evolutions as prescribed. She would not err in any way if she could help it. When she reached the flat, Hurstwood was not there. For a wonder, he was out looking for work, as she supposed. She took only a mouthful to eat and then practiced on, sustained by visions of freedom from financial distress, the sound of glory ringing in her ears. When Hurstwood returned, he was not so elated as when he went away, and now she was obliged to drop practice and get dinner. Here was an early irritation. She would have her work in this. Was she going to act and keep house? I'll not do it, she said, after I get started. He can take his meals out. Each day thereafter brought its cares. She found it was not such a wonderful thing to be in the chorus, and she also learned that her salary would be $12 a week. After a few days, she had her first sight of those high and mighties, the leading ladies and gentlemen. She saw that they were privileged and deferred too. She was nothing, absolutely nothing at all. At home was Hurstwood, daily giving her cause for thought. He seemed to get nothing to do, and yet he made bold to inquire how she was getting along. The regularity with which he did this smacked of someone who was waiting to live upon her labor. Now that she had a visible means of support, this irritated her. He seemed to be depending upon her little $12. How are you getting along? He would blandly inquire. Oh, all right, she would reply. Find it easy? It will be all right when I get used to it. His paper would then engross his thoughts. I got some lard, he would add, as an afterthought. I thought you might want to make some biscuit. The calm suggestion of the man astonished her a little, especially in the light of recent developments. Her dawning independence gave her more courage to observe, and she felt as if she wanted to say things. Still, she could not talk to him as she had to Drouet. There was something in the man's manner of which she had always stood in awe. He seemed to have some invisible strength and reserve. One day, after her first week's rehearsal, what she expected came openly to the surface. We'll have to be rather saving, he said, laying down some meat he had purchased. You won't get any money for a week or so yet. No, said Carrie, who was stirring a pan at the stove. I've only got the rent and $13 more, he added. That's it, she said to herself. I'm to use my money now. Instantly she remembered that she had hoped to buy a few things for herself. She needed clothes. Her hat was not nice. What will $12 do to keeping up this flat, she thought. I can't do it. Why doesn't he get something to do? The important night of the first real performance came. She did not suggest to Hurstwood that he come and see. He did not think of going. It would only be money wasted. She had such a small part. The advertisements were already in the papers, the posters upon the billboards. The leading lady and many members were cited. Carrie was nothing. As in Chicago, she was seized with stage fright as the very first entrance of the ballet approached, but later she recovered. The apparent and painful insignificance of the part took fear away from her. She felt that she was so obscure it did not matter. Fortunately, she did not have to wear tights. A group of 12 were assigned pretty golden-hued skirts which came only to a line about an inch above the knee. Carrie happened to be one of the 12. In standing about the stage, marching and occasionally lifting up her voice in the chorus, she had a chance to observe the audience and to see the inauguration of a great hit. There was plenty of applause, but she could not help noting how poorly some of the women of alleged ability did. I could do better than that, Carrie ventured to herself in several instances. To do her justice, she was right. After it was over, she dressed quickly, and as the manager had scolded some others and passed her, she imagined she must have proved satisfactory. She wanted to get out quickly, because she knew but few, and the stars were gossiping. Outside were carriages and some correct youths in attractive clothing, waiting. Carrie saw that she was scanned closely. The flutter of an eyelash would have brought her a companion. That she did not give. One experienced youth volunteered anyhow. "Not going home alone, are you?" he said. Carrie merely hastened her steps and took the 6th Avenue car. Her head was so full of the wonder of it that she had time for nothing else. "Did you hear any more from the brewery?" she asked at the end of the week, hoping by the question to stir him on to action. "No," he answered, "they're not quite ready yet. I think something will come of that, though." She said nothing more then, objecting to giving up her own money and yet feeling that such would have to be the case. Hurstwood felt the crisis and artfully decided to appeal to Carrie. He had long since realized how good-natured she was, how much she would stand. There was some little shame in him at the thought of doing so, but he justified himself with the thought that he really would get something. Rent day gave him his opportunity. "Well," he said as he counted it out, "that's about the last of my money. I'll have to get something pretty soon." Carrie looked at him askance, half suspicious of an appeal. "If I could only hold out a little longer, I think I could get something. Drake is sure to open a hotel here in September." "Is he?" said Carrie, thinking of the short month that still remained until that time. "Would you mind helping me out until then?" he said appealingly. "I think I'll be all right after that time." "No," said Carrie, feeling sadly handicapped by fate. "We can get along if we economize. I'll pay you back all right." "Oh, I'll help you," said Carrie, feeling quite hard-hearted at thus forcing him to humbly appeal. And yet her desire for the benefit of her earnings wrung a faint protest from her. "Why don't you take anything, George, temporarily?" she said. "What difference does it make? Maybe after a while you'll get something better." "I will take anything," he said, relieved and wincing under reproof. "I just as leave dig on the streets. Nobody knows me here." "Oh, you needn't do that," said Carrie, hurt by the pity of it. "But there must be other things." "I'll get something," he said, assuming determination. Then he went back to his paper.